Good morning. Welcome to the IDB conversation with finance ministers from Latin America and the Caribbean, a discussion with finance ministers on fiscal programs. For this session, we have Ms. Anne Lanks from The Economist as moderator. Ana?
Muchas gracias, Mariela. Y muchas gracias al BID.
Thank you, Mariela, and I'd like to thank the IDB for organizing this event, and I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us. I think the word that has been most repeated this week has been uncertainty. So I think we are now redrawing the rules of international trade, and economic policies of the most developed countries seem to be changing every day. And as international trade is now going through a reconfiguration, some of the countries in our region are now faced with increasing debt levels, faced also with pressures that could lead to higher inflation and also more daunting and challenging external conditions. Today we're going to discuss what this means, this new economic instability, and what it means to the countries represented here. What measures are being taken to address this? But first, we're going to give each participant 7 minutes just to provide an overview of the economic situation in each country. And I think we should start with a country that is experiencing one of the most radical and most really impressive changes that are going on, and that's Argentina. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to have this opportunity to share what's going on, what we are doing. And we truly believe that we are carrying out a significant structural change in Argentina. None of this would have been possible without President Milei, who has the firm conviction and a clear view as to the path that we need to follow in order to get out of the chronic, decades-long crises. And I don't want to offend anyone politically, but we're talking about 20, 40, even 100 years of history of mistaken, erroneous economic policies during that time. So we start off with that vision. We have a clear view as to the path that needs to be taken and a firm conviction that we can undertake these transformation processes. So the starting point for that transformation process was, first of all, the focus on avoiding these major crises like we saw in 1989 that led to runaway inflation and created an outbreak of hyperinflation during the 1990s. And then we also had the Rodrigazo, an economic and social crisis, 2001. We saw a very critical situation with when Argentina withdrew from the convertibility structure that it had. So the main challenge was to avoid that macro level explosion as we had seen in the past on several occasions, and also to avoid the social costs that these crises imply. So our focus was to make fiscal adjustments as quickly as possible. We achieved that in just a couple of months. We went from an enormous deficit in our public sector accounts. We transitioned to a monthly surplus that we have now maintained throughout the whole year, with a couple of exceptions due to inflationary factors, but with the focus on putting our public accounts house in order, so that we can again restructure our macroeconomic outlook, working closely with the central bank to also restructure and the central banks, the balances. This was crises that led to enormous currency emissions, and we were every 2 months, we were faced with these situations, and we made a sudden change. And also looking at our financial policies, how we needed to manage the interest rates. Most of the authors talked about raising interest rates to astronomical levels, so then we'd see a drop in demand, and that the the peso would be now in higher demand, we had a very different view. So from a monetary perspective, our focus helped to deactivate this enormous deficit that had been incredible proportions from the very beginning. Civil society in Argentina strongly supported these changes. We had that consensus to do what needed to be done, and I think had we not had that consensus, the story might have been very different. But having voted for a president who stated from the very beginning what he was going to do with a firm conviction that he was going to push this through to the end, that is what I think created that strong consensus from the public in support of these measures. And we were very cautious to not have an impact on the most vulnerable sectors of our society. So from the very beginning of our administration, we focused mainly on strengthening social assistance programs, at the same time putting our house in order, where we especially those areas where there had been a great deal of mismanagement of all types. This allowed us to target more resources for improving social programs. And as we moved forward, we went from a deficit of 5 percentage points. We wound up with a surplus of 2 percentage points, exceeding last year. And our belief is that this year we will continue down that path. We will be able to maintain this unwavering path toward fiscal solvency, and this has created a space so that other policy tools will be able to also take shape to continue to increase their momentum in order to support the macroeconomic stability, exchange policy, financial policies that will support reducing country risk, where we had 500 base points from 2,800 base points when we started in this administration. The support from the international community through the IMF, the World Bank, and the IDB has also been a key player, and it's understood our priorities and needs and understood what we consider to be the most appropriate steps to take. All of this together, taking all that together, we know that there's been, vis-a-vis the rest of the world and within our own society, people know that what we're doing and they're going to support us. This is going to be a challenging year. We have elections coming up, midterm elections, which also brings their own challenges. We need to once again show that we're not doing what was done by previous elections, where in midterm elections there was total unrestrained expenses in the election campaigns. The president this year said, no, we're going to continue with our austerity measures, and we will be faithful to this path, as the IMF already showed in its report this week, that has already forecast that Argentina is the country that's going to have the greatest growth for now and also for the next couple of years. I like what you said about the support for social programs. We'll delve into that a little further. Costa Rica, could you provide us with your perspective on the situation there? Yes, thank you. I'm going to just divert a little bit from what was said earlier. We have 5 years of uncertainty since 2020 with the pandemic, and then subsequently we had the overall inflation in Europe and throughout the world. And now the core inflation, and then in the area of international trade that not only has to do with trade, but also there's some political implications. And I think there are some key elements that where I see Costa Rica has done a really good job, contrary to other countries that have not been able to successfully conduct fiscal reform. Costa Rica did it in 2008. So there was a certain reticence. Actually, we had a great deal of resilience. During the pandemic, as you said, many countries became highly indebted. The indebtedness was significant, and we were not prepared in order to confront a drop in revenues and incomes of this dimension. And I think here we have a lot that we could point out. At that time, the multilateral organizations became the major driving engines in supporting sustainability. And we had in Costa Rica loans, and we were the first country that had access to the Resilience Fund. This, in turn, allowed us to carry out structural reforms, and that's an issue that I think needs to be at the center of all of the discussions taking place in countries, and in particular, from the lessons learned that should we need to look at that in multilateral organizations. We need to strengthen fiscal resilience, as Carlos said when he talked about vulnerable groups. That's essential because it's based on sound public finances. Without sound public finances, you cannot carry out meaningful social programs. So Costa Rica was able to create that resilience. Today we face very complex situations. Some countries have not been able to reduce debt. Costa Rica reduced its debt by 8 percentage points. And the debt ratio, and I think that reflects to a certain extent that fiscal reforms need to go hand in hand, not only with increase in revenues, tax revenues, but also reducing expenditures. In Costa Rica, we have a new fiscal rule that stated that the economic growth has to be a certain percentage, and this of GDP. Well, this reduced the size of the state, didn't strangle it though. So we need to see how we can maintain the functions of the state. That doesn't mean that we're going to cut the state organizational structure, but we need to look at what is relevant. And Argentina, I think, is a very good example that shows that you need to trim a lot of the fat in the public sector. And I think we need to conduct these analyses so that we can be more precise as to how we can strategically trim that fat. I think there's two major points here in our discussion. First, we need to have the state that is the right one that is aimed at strengthening up opportunities of growth, job, health, education, and that is done through the government, through the state. The second key pillar or the area that we need to pay attention to has to do with debt management. There's a lot of work ahead of us in that area, and I think the multilateral organizations are going to have to be clear that countries that are indebted are faced with such an enormous level of uncertainty that markets don't know where to go. So in the next few months, countries are going to have to be funding and issuing, and here we're going to see conditions that are not necessarily reflecting country risks, rather market uncertainty. And that is something that we need to establish some sort of tool or mechanism to manage this better. And I say all this because after the compliance with the targets, the structural reforms established by the IMF, I think there's an enormous opportunity. In fact, Costa Rica, looking at the context of the IMF, this is a very successful example of a reform program. And I think in the process, we need to consolidate not only the reforms undertaken, but also give that resilience to the country for the future. We need to establish a series of mechanisms that will allow the country to become even more resilient. And I say this because in many countries that are indebted, they're going to have to be confronting payments over the next few years and months. And I think the loans for budgetary supports are essential so that countries can create the space that is necessary. Interest rates are going to remain high for a long time. That's what we envision. So we need to start thinking about what needs to be done to restructure. Restructure is a bad word. What can we do to better manage the debt? In the case of Costa Rica, and we were discussing this with Felipe, at a World Bank meeting, out of every 100 colones that are collected, 35 colones per 100 are spent on paying interest. So we have a primary surplus over the last 4 years, which means that from the practical perspective, interests are strangling us, preventing the capacity to increase the quality of expenditures. That's where we need to focus our attention over the next few years, because the debt will remain. There's no way to pay a debt of these dimensions, in particular the debts that were assumed during the pandemic, in order to ensure that sustainability. And one thing I want to add to that, countries that are successful in responding to the needs of the people are successful countries. Those countries that cannot respond to security issues, to access to social programs, and also mobility, these are failed states or potentially failed states. So we need to put a lot of effort, especially in our region, as our region is faced with not only external tensions, but also internal tensions. And the social programs need to be addressed in a relatively short period. Costa Rica has been successful in navigating these complicated scenarios because its institutional strength, as well as the efforts undertaken together with the multilateral banks, has provided that room, that space that, again, enables maintaining high standards of living standards and at the same time carry forward these structural reforms underway over the last few years. Yes, well, we know that I'm from Nicaragua, and we always look with envy at Costa Rica because of their sound institutions and the way they successfully navigate and manage their economy. Let's move on to Panama. Thank you very much, Anna, and I'd like to thank the IDB for this kind invitation to participate in this interesting discussion, and I want to thank the audience for their interest in following these discussions. So the case of Panama is also a very interesting one. It's a government, an administration that has just entered into office. It's been in office now for about 9.5 months, and what leads me to accept for the first time a public position was that shared vision with the president, President Molino, in terms of this full or total commitment to confront these significant challenges the country has inherited for various reasons, as was already mentioned by my colleague, Minister Costa. We still are faced with the aftershocks of the pandemic. Looking at the pandemic back 5 years, the first one was the human impact, a traumatic human impact that we still have not seen end. We still see it impacting in quality of life as well as in levels of employment. And secondly, the geopolitical events in Europe that unleashed a rapid inflation, followed by interest rates in a period where we saw increases, very sharp increases, more than we had seen for a long time, at least in this century, perhaps even further back than that. So in addition to that, we faced in Panama, we faced other commitments that we've had to address. We have a crisis involving a pension system, a situation that I think everybody's familiar with. There's a copper mine, a very significant one globally and for Panama. Major challenges where we saw, for example, issues with the Panama Canal because of scarcity of water. And then the other major consequence of, especially, from the two events we talked about, the pandemic and inflation, has to do with public finances. The debt, as was mentioned by my colleague, the first real aftershock was that spectacular increase in the debt. We almost doubled our debt, not only in nominal terms, but also vis-a-vis as a percentage of GDP. So initially, we had relatively low interest rates. And then it was in an unusual situation with inflation. We saw a sharp increase, the marginal cost of refinancing the debt. And the debt from the prior administration has made it much more expensive to confront amortization as well as the current fiscal situation. So during the last 9.5 months, and I've been with my colleague on several panel discussions, and he was asking me in a forum of investors organized by CAF in Panama, and how long have you been in the position? I was asked, and I said, 7 years. No, excuse me, I made a mistake. It's not 7 years, it's 7 months, although it seemed like 7 years. And we still hadn't faced a lot of the events of the last 33 days. So never a dull moment, as people say. So having said that, the president and myself, we share a vision. And this is what really motivated me to take on this challenge, because we believe in a potentially brilliant future for Panama, which is still a long way off. We need to maximize these advantages, the competitive as well as geographical advantage. We have not maximized that to the fullest. I could discuss this at length. And in fact, what the commitment we made in a short time has led to creating and coming up with new results. For example, we know that accumulated debt has generated a major deficit, but it was clearly explained away by events that included the approval of substantive fiscal reforms as a part of the legislation on fiscal responsibility. It's actually the most ambitious legislation since 2008 to try to achieve a soft landing, strategic plan, government plan with the launching of an institution, strategic planning, very similar to many of the Asian countries that have these same generational long-term views. Then addressing the pension problems. 3 governments had been talking about proposing these pension reforms and didn't do it. And then looking at the creation of and this was a major undertaking to explain to the idea of this new pension initiative that is inspired by the Swedish example. So the results were not what we had hoped for overall, but I think with these complex reforms, I was expecting the worst case scenario. And we wound up with 85% completion. And immediately afterwards, the president announced that we were going to address the issue of the copper mine, just a few days later. He withdrew the arbitration with the Republic of Panama, and consistent with the announcement that we were going to enter into discussions in order to address this challenge. Then we were talking about the scarcity of water that not only led to a crisis with the Panama Canal that represents 5% of our GDP revenues, and it is the same proportion in terms of global trade. It has an impact in our public finances. It represents about 25 cents to the dollar that comes into the public coffers, and the creation of a new lake that would provide a new source of water, a reservoir for the canal, a new source, and some other ambitious undertakings that I can discuss at length. Well, I see, thank you very much. You have many political and economic challenges, and we're going to delve into this even further. But before that, Gabriela, could you provide us an overview of the situation in your country?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to the bank for the invitation. As Felipe was saying, we do have some things in common. We tend to meet at activities of this sort. He's been doing this for 7 months, but I've scarcely been in office for a month and a half. And also I come from the private sector with no public sector experience. So having said this, I'd like to make a few general comments before I speak about Uruguay. First, I think that we're looking at three global trends which frame our public policy discussion in the region. The first has to do with climate change and the challenges it poses for public policies in general, especially on the fiscal front. For the tax transitions we want to promote and also the expenditures related to extreme events, these are a challenge that compel us to take a proactive stance. Then we have technology and AI, which brings major challenges not just for our jobs, but also for our pension systems. There are monumental changes affecting where people work and how and what pension system they contribute to. So that would have an impact for future liabilities. And thirdly, we have what I would call, perhaps somewhat pompously, the revival of neo-protectionism and tendencies in public policies at the global level. And this is significant because, as our great colleague and almost founding father, Enrique Iglesias, have said, we are seeing a change in times, not just living in times of change. So we're seeing a shift towards protectionist policies, and that is happening because it is what the majorities in industrialized countries want. An increase in protectionism, limits on the movement of people, that is what the middle classes are asking from their leaders. It is not random that we're seeing this in Europe and in the US as well. So I would not consider what we have seen in recent weeks as something that is temporary. I would invite all public policymakers to change the way they think, because the rules of the game have changed. They're no longer the rules we have negotiated multilaterally. I'm not saying that these rules are being done away with, but they're being redesigned, and that will mean new rules of the game for institutions like this bank and others in the neighborhood. So this is a key issue as we try to describe the international situation. Moving to my second point, where does Uruguay stand in grappling with these international trends? Well, as others have said, we're seeing the cost of our foreign debt grow. It's not a commodity-friendly environment, and this is due to protectionist trends as well as trends related to what is happening with the exchange rate market. So it's uncertainty not only globally, but also regionally. Argentina, as the chair has said, has introduced a series of changes aimed at macroeconomic stabilization, but the rest of the region, not just Argentina, is grappling with significant challenges. So that is what I would say is what is happening currently. Our administration took office on the 1st of January and is dealing with this. We want to achieve political stability. We want to protect our democratic institutions based on a robust party system, and we want to be careful with our macroeconomic situation. It hasn't been very stable, but it's been more stable than what we used to have. There are challenges for the region. Argentina has dealt with its challenges. We had our challenges in the 70s and resolved them in a consistent manner. Despite our strength, we're still a small country open to the world in an unstable region, which is vulnerable to external shocks. That means that our macroeconomic soundness and our levels of inflation are two crucial elements that our government is addressing. We need to grow at faster rates than in the past 10 years, which have stood at 1%, barely. And if we grow faster, we cannot sustain the current model, and that is the main challenge we face in a context where public finances are relatively weak but stable, and the government is fully committed to focusing on greater fiscal consolidation over the next 5 years. We'll be revising our fiscal rules. We've been advocating changes in the budget area, and we are also strongly committed to reducing inflation, as did the previous administration. Inflation stands at 6%. We want to bring it down to 4.5% over the next 2 years. So this means remaining committed to macroeconomic stability. But even with some stability and some political instability or stability, these conditions are good but not sufficient in order to deal with the challenges of today. So this means that we have to do more of what we have done before. We have to become more competitive, step up the productivity of our factors. We need to promote improvements in our pricing system, fostering competition, and also looking at price indexation, which were left from our previous system. In our country, we value social cohesion and standing together, which brings huge challenges. We need to make a series of changes, but we need to keep a fair amount of coexistence. And what I would like to mention is our poverty levels for children and adolescents are too high. People who work, who have formal jobs, they have reasonable social protection in the areas of health, pensions, and on-the-job protection. But if they're not covered by the formal employment system, which is the case for 10% of the population, they're highly vulnerable socially. And that means children and adolescents are hit directly. For every adult in poverty, we have 10 children and adolescents who live in poverty. So that is one of the main challenges we're facing through our fiscal policies. Thank you very much, Gabriel. From outside, Uruguay looks at it as a country like everything is perfect, so your message has surprised me a bit. Thank you for your presentations. We're going to go to questions now. I will have some country-specific questions first and then go to more general questions, starting with Argentina, which, as we heard, is going through major changes. We've all seen how you've cut public spending, you've abated inflation, and signed a new agreement with the IMF. Could you explain why this agreement would be more successful than the previous 22 agreements, and why is investor confidence in Argentina up currently? Why is it different this time? Well, because we did what the fund usually asks countries to do, or at least what it was asking Argentina to do in the past with prior agreements, where we've done our homework. We did a fiscal adjustment, we improved efficiency, we made progress with deregulating the private sector. We're moving ahead with privatization and shutting down SOEs. We have also liberalized our exchange rate market, which was one of the issues we thought was constraining the growth possibilities of the Argentine economy because of the lack of foreign investment. The CIPO, as it is known, made it difficult for companies to come in because they would not be able to take their profits with them. So now we have lifted restrictions to make it more attractive to invest in Argentina. So those are basically the reasons. We've done our homework in advance of this agreement, and that is why we believe things will be different. We were not in a rush to reach this agreement. Negotiations began around the middle of last year. Things moved faster because of international factors, not because of our national situations, and things were solved at this point. So I think it's important to note that that is why we are convinced that things will work out this time. It will be different because we did not follow the standard IMF manual. We were able to convince the staff and the board of what we wanted to do going forward, and that we needed the support of the IMF, the World Bank, and the IDB in order to build a sufficiently large buffer to deal with potential any attacks or speculation. Regarding the reserves, in order for the IMF plan to work, the central bank has to build sizable reserves, but uncertainties regarding the global economy have brought the oil prices down, and this could also happen with commodity prices. Those are Argentina's main exports. What will you do to build reserves given this situation? I'd like to say a few things. First, even though we have some intervention bands, the exchange rate within those bands remains completely flexible, and we have no interest in changing that, which would be the easiest way, one would think, to build reserves. The agreement does call for reserves, and we understand that for external investors, these reserves are important. But if we go to a floating regime, the level of reserves should no longer be an issue. Along the way, we do have to meet some milestones. We have agreed with the fund, but at the same time, we are developing our oil and gas sectors in a way that is truly impressive. There are some investments underway which will quickly enable us to triple our level of oil and gas exports. And we think this is one of the main sources which will generate foreign exchange for the future. Understanding that commodity prices currently are slightly below the average of recent years. Our rural areas are also a driver, a sector that is growing, and we're going to put in place measures that will unleash its productivity potential. This will also contribute to our exports. The other untapped sector is our mining sector. We have done very little there in Argentina, and it's a question that always comes up. We have a symmetrical mountain range with Chile, and Chile has been able to harness its mining resources. Argentina has not. This may be a political decision. In Argentina, anything that is below ground is owned by the provinces, not by the national government. So it's up to the provincial governments to reach a decision to develop the regulations that are needed in order to tap those resources, which would generate dollars for the financial system, as well as business opportunities and jobs for the private sector and for the people who live in those provinces. Yesterday, I moderated a very interesting panel with the presidents of central banks of a number of countries, and the governor of the Jamaican Central Bank spoke about the plan they implemented with the IMF a decade ago. And it was very interesting, I thought, because he said that the key elements to truly overhaul the economy were strong institutions and having broad-based social and political support from various sectors. They were able to broker a huge social compact. When I lived in Argentina, it seemed to me that that was what the country was missing, precisely. That extreme polarization makes it hard to have sound long-term policies. You mentioned that there currently is social support for your reforms. But how will you ensure that the major changes we've seen over the past year and a half will be lasting? That's an excellent question. Last year, for example, we signed something called the May Pact, Pacto de Mayo. The president and 19 governors, provincial governors, signed this compact. It's the first time in history that a president doesn't have the support, doesn't have a single governor from his political party, but was able to reach a consensus with 19 governors from different political parties agreeing on a medium and long-term agenda. The May Pact includes 10 items which indicate Argentina's trajectory over the next 10 years, and it speaks of structural reforms, of fiscal balance, of a public spending level consistent with Argentina's ability to pay for it over time. 25 points of GDP, speaks of a reform of the pension system, also of the way national and provincial resources are allocated. It also includes a tax reform. So there is a majority agreement. There's a consensus that all of these things need to happen. We reach an economic and social situation of such magnitude in 2023 that beyond political differences, there is consensus, social consensus, that that is where we should be headed. Last year, two major laws were approved. One is a law which lays the foundation for a large set of reforms to be undertaken. The official party has 15% of the House of Representatives, led of 10% of seats in the Senate, and yet those two laws were approved, and they involve an entire set of structural reforms. The challenges are huge. We still need to carry out a structural reform agenda, but as social consensus builds and results become more visible, we believe that the different forces are becoming more aligned. Uruguay, Mr. Gabriel, you mentioned climate change as one of the major challenges of our times. Recently, Uruguay had to contend with one of the worst droughts in its history. Its impact was still being felt last year. Your country is also a leader when it comes to renewable energy. Could you explain how the economy of Uruguay has adapted to climate change and what still needs to be done? Well, we have adapted symmetrically and with very different results, asymmetrically rather. The previous administration started, and we intend to continue to align our borrowing program with climate-based targets. We have issued bonds that have targets that are conditioned to achieving certain results in the climate front, and this is something we want to do more of because we believe that it's the right way to encourage both the public and private sectors to accelerate the transition process. And yet, even though we have been pioneers on this front, as you said, with the water crisis we had last year, we did not proactively manage the risks in the Montevideo metropolitan area. This is something that the previous administration and this administration, through a number of projects, are addressing projects with various international organizations. So Uruguay has taken a strategic stance in different areas involving energy resources. We are dealing with those through our public finances, and we are in some ways on the leading edge when it comes to innovation and the issues the climate change agenda includes. But when it comes to water management, which is key, we have had to deal with a significant challenge and are still working on that. Our agenda includes important items. We intend to accelerate our decarbonization process, especially when it comes to public transportation. This is indeed a challenge for our public finances, as I said earlier, and that is because a large segment of our taxes come from non-renewables, and so that is going to have an impact on tax collection. Also, we're trying to promote the use of renewables, and for that we need to offer fiscal incentives. So we know that we will be facing a financial transition which will affect our public finances as a result of this, and it's something that we are getting ready for because we will be going ahead with it during this term of office. So that is how Uruguay is dealing with these challenges, because we believe that even though there may be some interruptions, it is a course that we need to maintain because these issues are very important. You're an example for the rest of the region. Panama, as a small and open economy, you're more reliant on global trade than others. What do the major changes happening internationally mean for the future of your country, and what are you doing to bolster your economy to deal with the challenges that are coming up? Well, as you say, small is beautiful, and that applies to our share of global trade and also what that means for our GDP. One advantage we have is that we're highly diversified and that we don't rely on any one specific sector. Looking back over the last 30 years, we see other crises which have had an impact on international trade. They've been triggered by other factors, by commodity prices, for one, and the main avenue, or rather those using the Panama Canal or the eastern part of Asia, from the eastern coast of Asia to the northwestern coast of the United States, and also there's traffic coming from other areas. When oil prices rose to $140 per barrel early this century, the canal became more competitive because the alternative is the water or maritime to ground route, which may be faster but much more expensive than the canal. So there's a fair amount of elasticity there. So what happened was that end users, we tend to think of shipping companies, they are actually there to serve the end clients, the Walmarts of this world. So they became more price sensitive than time sensitive. And that is something we may see again to a greater or lesser extent as we deal with a very unique situation we're dealing with. I like the word neo-protectionism and also neo-mercantilism because this dates back to the first part of last century, the first part of the 19th century even. So in that regard, the Panama Canal has the advantage of the fact that it has that flexibility. It has had a very pro-market tariff regime. What is known in English as revenue management. It has looked at what the market needs and what the market is willing to pay. So this means that there would be tariffs that would be very similar for everyone, with the exception of Mexico and Canada and the region. So this becomes an opportunity for Canada. Others may face higher tariffs, and what they can do is use Panama as a logistics platform, and not just as a maritime channel, but also as for air transport. So in very complex situation, what we need to do is try to identify those opportunities, those spaces that may become opportunities. And given that we are relatively small, nobody else notices if we take up those spaces, or at least it doesn't cause any trauma, as would happen if we were the size of Brazil and Mexico and even Argentina. Those kinds of changes would be felt at the regional level and at the global level. We've been able to make good use of that advantage in the past and are sure to do it again in this context. Speaking of new opportunities, Costa Rica is one of the countries that may benefit most from nearshoring because it's close to the US, to Canada. It has a skilled labor force. It has a booming technology sector. How do you plan to make the most of nearshoring opportunities, especially in today's context? I would say that the answer is no, because the context now is different from everything we've done before. Costa Rica has taken a medium and long-term approach. Some years ago, 25% of our GDP was in free trade zones. Now that number is 15%. And I think there's a few important elements. Number one, Costa Rica has more flexibility to change. I spoke to a friend a few days ago and I said that in the 80s we had many maquilas and they disappeared in 5 years because we became more expensive. Our workforce learns very quickly. I would even say this, 40% or 42% of exports are medical supplies. But we're not speaking of catheters, we're speaking of heart valves and a series of products which require significant specialization. And the other area we're working on is knowledge. We export knowledge. We may have a trade deficit, but on the services side, we have a surplus. The IDB's back office is in Costa Rica, and they do all the analysis. They work with templates. Everything is done there. So it's very interesting what we've been able to do there. I was saying the other day that the London Exchange has its product development department for investors in Costa Rica in a free trade zone. So I think that affords us a huge opportunity. So what have we done? As you well said, we have the advantage of being close by, but we also are doing things that are smart. When we get ready to access markets, we're the first country in the world when it comes to pineapple exports. And we're a small country. You would not expect this, but technology has made it possible for us to grow pink pineapples. They come from Costa Rica, and that is the kind of thing we are looking at. That's where our trade strategy is flexible. We look at markets, we find opportunities. So I think that's where we've been successful. We've done a good job. Chile has also done the same thing, and we find ways to place our products in other markets. And we've been working on this for many years. It's not just a recent strategy. And I say this because we have high levels of education. Social mobility is also high. The market opportunities we're looking for are not weak comparative advantages, they're robust. Costa Rica's workforce's productivity grows a lot faster than that of markets we compete with, and that is a significant factor in gaining market access. So there's been a lot of work done. We have a foreign trade ministry which focuses on maximizing opportunities to gain market access. And again, as I said, we have a skilled labor force, we have strong healthcare institutions and markets, and all of that attracts investments to our country. That's been our forte. We've attracted productive foreign investors, focusing on markets where we are strong. We currently export to 185 countries in the world. The U.S. may be our main trading partner. I think about 40% of our exports go to that country, and yet it is just another market, and diversification is what gives us our strength.
Bueno,
Well, we've run out of time, but I'm going to ask each one of you just to wrap it up with some final remarks. 2 minutes for each panelist, please. Well, from the Argentine perspective, I think the most important issue, and we've been discussing this, and that's the idea that although we know it's difficult to carry out the adjustments, but when it's necessary, you have to do it, and you can do it. The only way to provide greater sustainability, as we were discussing, especially in this scenario of uncertainty, we need to put our house in order. And as you're able to do that, including structuring your accountants, then you begin to identify those key management priorities. We begin to also address the internal macroeconomic challenges, and also to help absorb international shocks. For me, the key takeaway is that we need to be clear that when things are well communicated and properly communicated, people understand it, and they accept and take on the challenge when they understand that things are being done in a serious-minded way, and this is a benefit that we will enjoy sooner than later. Minister Acosta? I think, in essence, the process has to do with credibility. You need to have credibility in your reforms. You need to have credibility in your country. And another key issue, and it has to do with the sustainability of reforms. And if you discuss and explain, if you can, to explain Costa Rica's success over the last 7 years, I would say that it boils down to be clear, have clear fiscal rules, and abide by them, because many countries have developed these rules and procedures, and then they start changing things along the way. Other countries that have implemented tax reforms, and then they start again changing and finding different loopholes. I think we need to also conduct a sound evaluation of tax expenditures. I think countries need to start looking at these subsidies, and exemptions have to end at some point. You have to draw the line somewhere. You cannot just provide these exemptions that suddenly just become a burden, dragging the countries down. So we need to pay special attention and just be sure that when we also conduct this, it's important to take into account the multilateral organization's role. We need to transition from studies to concrete actions. We need to have these advisors that are also partners in the transformation process. And I think that's an excellent opportunity to help the country face successfully these serious challenges. And I know I'm extending myself a little bit, but I wanted to offer 2 more observations. I was asked in 2023, when I came into the budget process, the government budget process, I was asked, what is my main concern? And I said, well, this is what concerns me. We need to have instruments that will address these catastrophic events. And another issue that I think is essential to point out is how we can create resilience. Just to follow up on my colleague from Uruguay's comments, I wanted to add that Costa Rica is a coffee producer, produces some of the finest coffee in the world. but the temperatures are rising, and coffee requires certain elevations and also certain temperatures. How can we make sure that these crops become more resilient to climate change? In the case of Costa Rica, they're not going to expand their agricultural sector. It's not a part of that. So we need to focus on these other important elements. One other issue, we need to also be concerned about rising sea levels. One way or another, these environmental issues are having an impact on this. We focus mainly on the soil, but we also need to look at the seas and the rising seas. And I'm saying that because Costa Rica actually has 5 times more area in the sea than on land. Thank you, Minister Chapman. Well, I'm going to be very brief, and I really enjoyed Gabriel's comment and quote of Enrique Iglesias that we're not in a period of change, we're in a change of period. And I agree with what you're saying about resilience. We are experiencing some moments in history that are not going to change in the long term. The volatility and uncertainty are here to stay. They're here to stay. And resilience is going to be vital in the hemisphere and for the countries of the region. And in the face of adversities that are not new, I believe firmly in the creative powers of human beings and the force of the markets. Just to give you an example, when there was a major drought that affected the Panama Canal, that reduced, it went from 35 ships transiting per day to 18 ships transiting per day. And many global actors made immediate adjustments. Enormous ships, just to give you an example, Maersk, that made a huge investment in Panama. They bought the interoceanic railway, and it shows firmly how they are going to put money, and this reflects their optimism. And I would say that this operator is more vulnerable than even the Panama Canal. What did Maersk do? Since they were not able to transit 14,000 or 15,000 containers across the canal, they reduced the number of containers, and they were able to move the others through the rail and pick it up. I know it's more complex, it's more costly, but the market took charge, looking at the infrastructure, looking at potential opportunities. They maximized those opportunities. They were one of the actors that, in the face of climate crisis, they were able to show flexibility, creativity, and resilience, and they were able to successfully confront a very daunting challenge. So within this pessimistic outlook, we see some pearls that, and I'm sure that human creativity will know how to deal with these types of adverse circumstances. Thank you. Minister Odone. I think we should not lose sight of what we were mentioning at the beginning in terms of the change of period. And it has several implications. The world that we built in the post-World War II scenario, and in particular during the 1980s, is probably the longest period of sustained peace and prosperity and reduction of inequalities in history. It's based on 3 pillars: the mobility of capital, the mobility of people and goods. That's a key reflection in a context that when it almost seems like we're now revisiting this. But the model generated within certain economies high levels of inequality. And those high levels of inequality are associated with the mandates of countries have in terms of their changing of policies. I think that's at the heart and soul of what we're looking at. So from the perspective of a small country like Uruguay, We only have 3 million inhabitants, and we're used to resisting change and to address external shocks, both price shocks, terms of trade, and regional complexities. And the only formula that we discovered is based on 3 factors: strong democratic institutions based on political party systems where you have alternating parties in office, also economic consistency, macroeconomic consistency that allows for marshaling those resources, because social cohesion is essential. Without that level of social cohesion, and if you're not able to address inequalities, put that under control, then the probability of society to respond and resort to policies or parties that are not conducive for success in the country, you're going to fail. So Uruguay is proud of its political system, and today I'm proud to be a part of that this government. But our system of coexistence is based and rooted on powerful political parties and alternating political parties in office. That's a source of great satisfaction for us. Thank you, Minister. I feel that there's so many more questions we could ask. We're going to have to request another panel discussion. But once again, thank you all very much for participating in this panel.